Egocentric attribution is this. People attribute more responsibility to themselves for positive outcomes than others attribute to them. People look at a situation that they were involved in and say, you know, boy, I had a lot to do with that outcome, when in fact there are other people looking at it would think that person didn't have a lot to do with it. The danger, and where that really comes into play, is this. When you combine that with a hindsight bias, you create the worst possible attribution for the plaintiff, and the biggest single trap for the plaintiff, which is defensive attribution. The jury looks at the situation that the plaintiff was in and says, I would not have acted as the plaintiff acted. Therefore, I would not have had the plaintiff's outcome. And of course, they're looking at it from hindsight, but it's called defensive attribution because the juror is defending themselves by saying, this could not happen to me. They're doing it by attribution. Attribution is they attribute different conduct to the plaintiff than they would have done. So a juror who is, especially one who is similarly situated to the plaintiff, will look at the situation and say, that plaintiff did something differently than I would have done, therefore this could never happen to me. The more severe the tragedy, the more horrible the damages, the more the jury will want to distance themselves from the possibility that this could happen to them, so the more they will apply defensive attribution. So you have to be very careful in voir dire examination and in choosing and in exercising your strikes about picking someone who is more similarly situated to the plaintiff on causation issues. You have a woman who's 37 years old and her child died as a result of a negligence of a driver, and you look at her and say, well, here's a 37-year-old woman on the panel who has a child. Boy, she will identify with the loss of a child. She'll be a great juror for me. No, actually she won't. That's the worst possible person you could pick in all likelihood, because that woman will want to distance herself from what happened to the plaintiff. So in order to distance herself from what happened to the plaintiff, that woman will say, that woman did something differently than I did. It was her fault. Therefore, this could never happen to me. The intensity factor is the blame of the plaintiff increases in direct proportion to the intensity of the injury. The worse the injury, the more blame they'll place on the plaintiff, just by way of distancing. So you consider striking jurors who share the most similarities with factors which were causative of the injury to the plaintiff. There's also self-serving attribution, jurors who attribute causation based on what serves their own perceived best interest. Those are the tort reformers. These are people who get on the jury and try to bring in a defense verdict and try to bring the other people to a defense verdict, their own best interest. They foolishly think that that's going to reduce their own insurance rates, that type of thing. The confirmation bias. Once each person forms their own model about what this case is about, they seek evidence that confirms their model of the case. That's called the confirmation bias. Jurors see what they believe, and jurors hear what they believe. And what that means is once they form their beliefs during primacy portion of the trial, then they will hear things favorable to them and they will see things favorable to them being correct. Everybody wants to be right. Everybody wants to be the first one to figure out who done it. So when new evidence comes in, they have a choice. They can either accept it, they can modify it to fit their model, or they can just outright reject it, or they can modify their model, which they do also. Modify their model of what the case is about based upon new evidence. Jurors reason backwards from the outcome to assign responsibility for an event. They reason backwards, and they reason backwards until they get to as often as not, until they get to the first causation, the first element of causation, and they stop at that point. Jurors stop at the last. When I say first, I mean last, actually, if they're reasoning backwards. Jurors stop at the last causative event. We've all seen it, and we all do it. Everybody talks about how the poor old basketball player who lost the NCAA tournament because the score was 102 to 101, and he had 2 free throws, and he missed both of them. All those other mistakes made by everybody else in the game, all through the game, and all those other chances they had to make 2 points, they go by the boards. The last causative event, missing the 3-pointer at the buzzer, that sort of thing. Those are the causative events. That's what I mean by reason backwards to the last causative event. Jurors do that. So you have to think about how do you cope with that. Jurors exaggerate what could have been anticipated. That is to say, what the plaintiff could have anticipated. Jurors view the outcome as appearing inevitable. And so you have to show that the outcome was not inevitable. How do you show that the outcome was not inevitable? By showing all the defendant's choices, all the choices that the defendant had, which would not have resulted in this tragedy. You show positive choices by the defendant, and the more positive choices you show, the stronger your case is, the more they will hold it against the defendant. So you deal with all kinds of biases when you prove choices of the defendant. To overcome this, you stress what the defendant could have done differently. You emphasize the alternatives available to the defendant. They ascribe more knowledge to the plaintiff than the plaintiff may actually have had. So you show the plaintiff's precise knowledge. Because they're always saying, we hear them on focus groups, well, the plaintiff knew this, or the plaintiff knew this, or the plaintiff should have known this, or known this. So you show the plaintiff's precise knowledge, show what they actually did know. But most importantly, regardless of what the plaintiff knew, you show the defendant's superior knowledge about whatever the facts are. You show that the plaintiff was in control of circumstances. You show the plaintiff's personality and their bad choices based upon their personality, and you show the defendant's superior knowledge. Now, the next is belief perseverance bias, and that is that once a belief about a case is formed, jurors will cling to that belief as their own. And that's very simple because jurors want to be right. When they form their trial story, this becomes their model. It's now their trial story. And so they will cling to this belief as their own. The idea is to get the jury to adopt your trial story. And then when they adopt your trial story as their own, they will seek the evidence that supports that. Then you follow it with hard evidence. That's the middle part of your story. You follow it with hard evidence that strengthens the trial story that you've given them in the first place. So at that point, and this is a very important point, more compelling evidence is required to change a belief than to adopt it in the first place. So if you're thinking about, well, I've got this really strong piece of evidence here, and I think I'm going to save this for my closing part of my case. This is going to be the big finish. And so I'm going to put this on Friday of next week. Well, that may not work. That may not be the best choice for this reason. You want to put on your best evidence while they are forming their trial story. Early in the game, support it early, because more evidence is required to change a belief than it is to create one in the first place. So if you want to create a strong belief early, you put your best evidence on early, because later, through cross-examination and so forth, they may have already rejected your belief, and then you put your strong piece on at the end. It may not be enough, where it would have been enough when they were forming their beliefs in the first place.